Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members-only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. Today, since we were off for a week, since Kate was under the weather last week, and we'll get I was going to say we're going to get an update on that. I'm not going to put Kate on the spot. Of course we're not, but just to remind you that's why we missed an episode. It's funny. Before we started talking, I record the podcast at home, and when I was walking back to do it, I kind of suddenly I felt a little under the weather. I'm like, oh my God, are we going to miss 2 episodes in a row? But we're not. I think I just had some particularly bitter Starbucks coffee or something unseemly like that. In any case, because we missed last week, we still have to talk about the verdict. Although I guess the verdict, came out Thursday, so it would have been, we wouldn't have had it yet, but we weren't even in that waiting period yet before the verdict. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to devote a little time to a big shakeup at the Washington Post that is part of an ongoing story at the Post, sort of post-Trump membership decline that a lot of publications have dealt with, and that the Times, unlike almost everybody else, has managed to not take that hit seemingly. But the first thing I'm going to talk about, and it's what Kate and Jackie, our producer, and I were talking about before we started, and I have to say, I was reluctant to even bring this up, and maybe I'll discover after the fact that I was right to be reluctant, but here goes. And the reason I'm reluctant is because, so there's a new book out called The Fall of Roe, The Rise of a New America. And it is by 2 New York Times reporters, Elizabeth Diaz and Lisa Lehrer. And I have not read this book. I'm not even sure it's on books, in bookstores yet, but it's out for, there are reviews of it out. And I read the write-up of it in New York Magazine. And so what I'm going to say, let me put like a small asterisk by it by saying I'm interpreting the book based on how it is presented, right? How it's presented. So that could be conceivably a somewhat skewed presentation, but I don't think so, because I've looked at other reviews and I've poked around, and I think this is basically the perspective of the book. And I was surprised and incredibly frustrated by the presentation. And again, the reason I was a little hesitant to bring this up is because this is a book by 2 female journalists about Roe and Dobbs, and I'm a guy, and I fully recognize that is there's wisdom in letting the cup pass, as it were, in that kind of situation. But what I was struck by, and so in the New York Magazine write-up, the headline is "Sleeping Giants: A New Book Charts the Fall of Roe and the Failures of the Liberal Establishment." And the gist of the story is that liberals were caught asleep at the switch and didn't see it coming, and were complacent, and didn't see it coming, and it this kind of came out of nowhere. Talks about at one point that liberals and the liberal establishment thought they had won a permanent victory on abortion rights and reproductive reproductive health, reproductive rights, but though they were so mistaken. Um, and on the one hand, and again, we were discussing this before we came on, um, I was struck because I have been in I don't know, for lack of a better word, sort of the liberal ecosystem professionally for a long time, for a good 25 years or more. Um, and one of the most constant refrains has been the threat to abortion rights and the incremental erosion of abortion rights. Obviously, the final hammer fell with the overturning of Roe in 2022. But for years, as we know, there's been a slow process uh, made possible by evolving Supreme Court decisions that have let many states slowly erode abortion. You can still have an abortion, but you've got to, visit the clinic 3 times before you can get the abortion, or the clinic can't provide abortions unless meet the same regulatory requirements as a hospital. All this stuff we know. And I was thinking about why does this seem so perverse to me? Because you have certain stuff like one of the sort of the discussions in this article is Hillary Clinton said the right to an abortion was on the line in 2016, but then she went and lost, so she must have not taken her own warning too seriously. Otherwise, why would she have lost? And like, what? Like, how? I don't get that. And Planned Parenthood is presented as sort of like a kind of hyper funded and generally complacent organization that sort of didn't see it coming. And that's so that's so different from, obviously I have a certain kind of perspective, not as a woman and not as a woman of childbearing age, all that kind of stuff. But I think the reason it got to me was that this presentation seems part of a larger arc to me, which is that arc that I think we are all familiar with, in which only Democrats exist. Only Democrats, liberals, whatever you want to, whatever formulation you want to choose, only they have agency. There's not this other group that is half of our society that has its own agenda and own agency and does a lot of the stuff. And we even see that, we see that this year with in the discussion of the presidential election. Why did Democrats end up with Biden? Why isn't Biden winning? Why aren't the Democrats doing better? Well, I think one of the reasons is because there's another half the country that has its own agenda, and they're strong, and they figure into the equation too. Anyway, I was just very struck by, Kate. What do you either jump in here or maybe save me here? But what and again, I want to stress again, I have not read this book. I am going largely on the presentation of the book in this review in New York Magazine. So just have that asterisk that I am seeing it through that prism. But I don't know. It's not what I've seen in any of the last dozen elections, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it brings up a few things for me. One of which I said before we started recording, which is this could be a simple case of the abortion's hot, or the market's hot for abortion books right now. You've got two reporters who I assume have reported a lot on abortion in their careers. Everyone's going to be writing a book about the long arc of the anti-abortion movement and its relationship with the right and how we got here. Probably a lot less in the market for actually this is also Democrats' fault book. So it might just be a simple matter of kind of mercenary book writing. But
yeah, and sorry, go ahead.
Well, then the other piece that occurs to me is like it's really easy and snappy to kind of say how the liberal establishment was caught unawares. But I think, first of all, what are we talking about? Are you talking about Democratic politicians? Are you talking about big kind of reproductive rights organizations? Because in my reporting, the reproductive rights organizations were never, ever complacent about abortion rights. I mean, that's just silly. Like, people on the activist side of it have been acutely aware of the precarity of the right since Roe, you know?
Yeah.
And like you say, have spent tons of time kind of fighting trap laws and all the different efforts that left huge abortion deserts way before we got Dobbs. I think there is probably some fairer accusations to throw at the Democratic Party. I think abortion was not part of the platform in a meaningful way until it was ripped away. I think you could fairly argue that that was a failing, that
And
trying to do what the Republicans did in 2016 and make that race about the Supreme Court could have been a more salient part of the Democratic platform. But I do think there was also it was a harder sell because the general populace was complacent about
mhm.
abortion for a while. And there might be a chicken and egg thing there. Maybe you can blame Democrats for not making it salient so people didn't take it really seriously. So it didn't become such cudgel until Dobbs came down.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. If the argument is about the Democratic Party, the electoral Democratic Party, there's certainly an argument to be made. It goes back to Bill Clinton when they sort of tried to come up with this positioning on abortion of what safe, legal, and rare, kind of like we're going to protect your right, but it's kind of icky, so let's not talk about it too much. And so there's a whole argument there. But what I was struck by in the article, they're actually talking about Planned Parenthood to a great degree, which that seems very unfair. And the fact that Hillary Clinton lost the election, I don't think was for lack of trying, or
Yeah.
so.
The other thing that strikes me is just like you kind of have to unpack liberal establishment. I think you also have to unpack unprepared, because are we talking about squeezing electoral juice, unprepared in terms of the political shift this would unleash, which again, I remember there being some criticism at the time that the White House was not as kind of full throated as people expected afterwards, that there wasn't really a sense of they kind of had all these reproductive rights surrogates ready to spring to attention. And again, I think that's a fair critique. I think it fits within a problem we have with the Democratic Party a lot, which is being very slow to react, very kind of unprepared from an optics media standpoint in a way that Republicans are much better at jumping on moments. But if we're talking about unprepared in terms of how to meaningfully change the dynamic unleashed by the Supreme Court, this institution that Democrats have zero control over, well, then I think you're in a more unfair territory again, because I mean, what do we have, right? Maybe you could argue that Planned Parenthood should have started the construction of clinics on the border of states that were likely to lose their abortion rights, maybe. But, from the kind of political standpoint, Biden's kind of got this small bag of potential executive actions he can take. Some of the bigger ones, quote unquote bigger, which, could be maybe the whole abortion is legal on federal land type thing, would almost certainly get caught up in court. And again, not that he shouldn't do it, but the tools were limited. I mean, I think even the most kind of Democratic Party doesn't go far enough activist would admit that it's hard to paper this one over, right? Like, this is a really big deal. But, fundamentally, it's kind of, I think, the main problem is what you and I were talking about, which is this is so classic mainstream big media publication posture of we expect Republicans to be extremist and minoritarian, and that doesn't even warrant saying. So all the onus about being kind of responsible, making sure that people don't fall through the cracks here, all of that automatically shifts to Democrats. And you don't even have to mention the person or the party or the kind of side of the legal sphere that is inflicting the damage. That just gets put into the passive voice. And then it's Democrats aren't doing enough to react. And it's like, okay, to react to whom? It's pretty convenient that we're kind of excising from the story the perpetuators of the action.
It's funny in a different, again, on the broader only Democrats have agency argument. One of the people I follow, kind of election observer, number cruncher people I follow, was making this point on a social media site a couple days ago, that a lot of people have this idea that there's the Democratic Party, there's Democrat supporters, and then there's a whole universe of other people who are waiting for Democrats to finally have a true working class agenda so they can just finally support the Democrats, or a true reproductive rights agenda and they can support the, so it's there's no sense that, again, there's a lot of people who don't agree with the Democrats and they're trying to do things that we Democrats think are really bad, and they're smart too and they're powerful, and that's the world we live in. I mean, one kind of last point on this write up. One of the set pieces they give is, if people remember, Wendy Davis, who became in some ways kind of an early social media sensation about a decade ago, where she did, I'm trying to remember the parliamentary thing. I think it was basically a filibustering an anti-abortion law in Texas, became a big, a big sensation. She became super popular. I believe she ran for governor based on that. Obviously, the law ended up, they didn't pass it that time, but they passed it a few months later or the next year. She ran for governor and she got crushed. And this is presented as Democrats thought Wendy Davis was going to solve everything and Texas was going to be blue and everybody would get one free abortion and everything was going to be awesome. It's like, no, no one thought that. Like, what? Like, that's just I don't get this perspective on our politics. And I think for me, it is, again, it's something that I react to very viscerally as a way of understanding what America is and how American politics function. And again, that Democrats are there's no other force, there's no other America, and it's not another America that's just waiting for the Democratic Party to get its act together so they can support it. Anyway, anything else on this? I don't want to have the last word, but I guess we mostly talked about it.
No, I think in some ways this will kind of segue well into what we're talking about today, which is primarily a delayed chat on the big verdict. And I appreciate listeners for bearing with me. I lost my voice as one of the parts of this pretty just terrible illness. So unless we were going to do some ASMR, me whispering my part of the conversation, the pod was a little off the table. But back now at full strength. And it was funny to watch the verdict stuff. I was really sick, so I was a little bit kind of out of it. So it was an experience where I was more experiencing a big news event as just like a person rather than a reporter, which is always kind of funny how that happens. And this story also is, very much Josh Kavinsky. So it wasn't my primary thing, but you get so used to this, we're still in this kind of quote unquote age of Trump, of things just not being shocking anymore, of getting kind of numbed out to things that used to be sea changes in our politics, right? That's such a feature of the time we're living in. But when the verdict came down, it was Emotional, maybe? I mean, it was like I don't ever really watch cable news, but I turned it on because there is something momentous about an event like that kind of, happening live, and they're getting it into their earpieces, and the
I
legal
was
people
just
are
gonna
trying to, like, rip through the verdict real quick.
I was just gonna say the same thing because I watched it on CNN, and it was Jake Tapper who was the host, and there was this thing where I'm sure many of you saw something similar. He's like, kind of hand to the ear with the earpiece. I'm hearing guilty and guilty, and it has like it creates a kind of a vaguely Edward R. Murrow kind of vibe of like you're listening to Churchill's speech and you're giving a something like this, and it's different because we're so used to like, oh, you're seeing the video, we don't need you to tell us, Jake, we're watching it happen, but you're not watching
Right.
it happen because of all the things with no video in the courtroom. So it did have this kind of archaic trappings to it, how we found out, and 34 is a lot of counts when you've got to listen for each one and say, and it is guilty, and the next one is also guilty. And
Right.
I think as they were as the legal experts, there was after we knew there was a verdict, and there was what, like a half hour, 45 minutes of everybody getting their ducks in a row to to listen to the verdicts, there were legal experts basically pointing out, well, okay, you could have a first few guilties and then the rest aren't, and that would mean he basically beat it and stuff like that. And there were all these kind of ins and outs, and you hear the first half dozen, and then it keeps going, and you're like, okay, I think he's guilty of every single charge here. And so
Right.
there's this whole kind of tension to it that was kind of uncanny. I wouldn't say I found it emotional, but I did find it shocking in a way. Like,
I guess emotional is not. I felt excited. I thought it was exciting. And this is not a I mean, this is a case that everyone in the world is telling us that is not exciting, right? That is boring, that is pedestrian, that's too small, that's, going to attract all these claims of political motivation, that won't matter. And it's the same way I felt seeing Trump stuck at his defense table day after day, not getting to leave, not getting to talk. Like it's a big deal. I mean, despite all that flood of punditry, it feels like a big deal. And that's how this felt to me. It felt bigger than I thought it would. From kind of watching the political landscape these last few months and how little this trial has felt like it has broken through at all. It felt like a bigger deal than I thought it would to have 34 of 34 guilty charges, to kind of face the reality that despite, and we'll get into this, all the Republican shouts of it was rigged, blah, blah, blah. Like it's astonishing that you got these 12 people, random people who had this awesome task in front of this intimidating task, this task that could ruin their lives. And they listened and they were attentive and they took the job seriously and they asked questions to make sure they were getting it right. And it's brave. I think it's really
mhm.
brave to come down with this verdict, and it was something to see.
And people always say that about juries in high profile cases, and it's certainly true that you can, even outside of a Trump like context or like a mafia kingpin, even just having your face on the newspaper for a civilian is upsetting, or it does change things if everybody in the country knows who you are. But here we know that if these people become public, they're going to have like weirdos showing up at their house. So it is brave at a different level. I mean, much different level. And there's also you have that reality distortion vortex where I was I do not watch cable news much at all. The only time I watch it if it's on in when I'm at the gym, and it's just kind of it's on, and I watch because see what's going on. And there, probably usually it's MSNBC, and so listen to that commentary, and then I heard towards the end of the trial, I started hearing people say, "Yeah, it's anybody's guess." They really kind of beat up Michael Cohen and all this stuff. And I was wondering, like, okay, maybe I've gotten a distorted view of this from. I mean, it wasn't lost on me that I might get a kind of a distorted view from watching MSNBC. And that's not a dig on MSNBC. It's the people from the perspective of, wow, this criminal should face some accountability. That's a perspective I can that I can get behind. But and then there was the whole then there was a series of articles saying, well, there's this one juror and he keeps making googly eyes at Trump, and he really wants to be Trump's special friend, and they're thinking that's their ticket, that's the hung jury. He has a true social account, and he loves Newsmax and all this kind of stuff. And you hear that and you're like, shit, maybe. I always, as virtually everyone else who's thought about this, thought his hope was a hung jury. Very hard to imagine how, with these facts, you're going to get a jury to come back and say, yeah, he's totally clean, acquittal, totally not guilty. That's just not plausible. But could you have one or two people who either just because they're a ringer and they're kind of like a crypto Trumper, or just that they saw it differently, hangs the jury? But what so it was only afterwards when you saw some commentators saying the defense put on a crappy defense. And I do think that is true in this. And there was one, I can't remember who it was, made the simple point that the one thing the defense in any trial, but I guess particularly a criminal trial, you can't lose your credibility. Because if you lose your credibility, you're not credible on the technicalities that may, get your client acquitted. And they didn't really put on much of a defense. Half of their defense was Bob Costello, who just kind of got in a fight with the judge, and I don't know what that accomplished. I don't think it accomplished much factually. But I'm not sure they said it explicitly, but certainly they made clear that their view was that Trump never had sex with Stormy. That's fake news. And Michael Cohen, maybe this was just a kind of an effort to pay Stormy off to get back at Trump. And you're like, dude, come on. Like that is, if I was on that jury and the defense was saying Trump never had sex with Stormy, I would be like, dude, you were a total fucking liar. That is ridiculous. Like you're insulting my intelligence. And I do think that's kind of part of it, that they did the sort of after action commentary, the main critique I saw was that they just kind of denied everything and said everybody was a liar. And that, given this case, I mean, this is why I always thought, but again, there's rationality and there's how criminal trials work. I always thought the issue of Michael Cohen's credibility was not that big a deal, because what else, what's the alternative theory? When his fixer fixes this story and pays the money, so the story doesn't, what could the alternative theory possibly be? And it seems to me that they could have said, all right, he had sex with her, he was embarrassed, but you find some kind of, you focus in on one technicality of, maybe it's personal embarrassment versus campaign, and then it falls apart, or kind of like, I'm Trump. I'm spending my time on Twitter. I'm not paying attention to how things are logged in some ledger book somewhere, or in, kind of corporate Quicken. Like that, to me, that at least sounds like, okay, like, does Trump know how things are logged? I doubt it, So I don't know. There is that, again, the reality distortion field that we've become very familiar with Trump.
My concern was that they wouldn't have any trouble reaching the kind of falsification of records piece, but would fail to make the leap to, and that was in service of pulling one over on the voters and getting elected. Because that is, I mean, that's the attenuated part of the argument, right? You need to link those two things together. And I mean, that's a credit to the prosecution that they managed to do it and managed to make it seem like an important thing and not, impress upon the jurors that this is not just, this is business as usual in dirty, gritty New York. This is whatever. I mean, that was their whole, as you're saying, that was the whole thesis, right? Was basically like, well, everyone's a little slimy, so shouldn't punish our guy for it and kind of nobody else. But the prosecution managed to make a narrative that was tight enough that people could follow it and understand how this kind of business world manipulation directly tied into, the optics of the election and keeping information from the voters before it was time for them to make a decision.
I also think that argument is one that was designed for non-New Yorkers,
Mm-hmm.
frankly. Because I think if you're from New York, I mean, New Yorkers know that everything's slimy, but to the extent that I can interpret the city that I live in, that the mentality is more, yeah, they're all slimy, and this is our chance to kind of, hold someone accountable for all the sleazy stuff that happens. It's just not in the, I don't know. That sounds like something that's an argument you would make about New York and Texas or
Mm-hmm.
Arkansas or Florida or something like that. And also the kind of, everybody knows that Trump is not a businessman, right? He's not someone who uh, there's a million kinds of business in New York City, and many of them are very sleazy. But Trump is Trump. He's sui generis, right? And I don't think most uber wealthy New York businessmen are not, kind of on page 6 or running for president or sleeping with. I mean, maybe they are sleeping with porn stars, but they don't need to bring in the National Enquirer and all this kind of weird sui generis stuff that is just like, oh, that's how it is. Like it's not that it's not a kind of a sleazy place, but it's not sleazy like that. It's just different. He's sui generis. So even that argument seemed kind of weird and unwieldy to me.
I think it also had the accidental subtext of not being everyone's slimy, but being every rich person does this and they all get away with it. So why is our guy not getting away with it? Which I think has potential to backfire. There was this
Big,
really,
big time.
yeah, there's this really fascinating write up of one of Frank Luntz's focus groups in the New York Times this morning. And it was 11 people who, in the span from 2016 to 2020 had gone both Trump and Biden, perhaps Obama before.
Yep.
And one of the guys said this, and I thought it was really interesting. He was like,
I
if
know what
any of
you're
us
going to
had
say.
done this, we'd be out on our ass, right? We'd be having to drive for Uber or something. It's like, he was kind of countering someone being like, this wasn't a big enough deal with the argument that, well, for normal people, it'd be a pretty big deal, right? Like, no one's worried about putting you in jail. I thought that was really interesting. And it might have been the same guy, but someone else in the group as well said, if he can't even pull off a bribe without getting caught, I don't really trust him with the nuclear football, which is hilarious.
That was the one that I saw and really I do think this has always been, we've talked about this before. Impunity is his superpower. That people, I think some people see him and say he's a total sleazeball and I wouldn't let him be associated with anyone in my family, but he gets away with everything. So maybe let him run things and then we'll get away with everything. So I do think that there's a damage here that isn't like, oh, we can't be having a convicted felon, be in the White House. That is a step too far. There's a certain, and this is why I found the reading of the verdicts what I called shocking, why you were excited, that it is bracing to see this guy held to account. That there's not some abracadabra at the last minute where it turns out the judge lives in Trump Tower, and it just the nonsense world of Trump world, that it's like, not only are you going to have to sit there every day, like Kate was sort of, uh, uh, I don't know, whatever you would describe that feeling you had about that, but
Mhm.
you're guilty. You're guilty of every charge, and you're going to sit there and you're going to take it, and you can say whatever you want, but you got owned here. The joke is on you. This did not, you tried to pull every trick, and it did not work. Uh yeah, I think that's a big deal. And that, again, that is his brand. It's the impunity. And that's what, kind of, that he has to sit there, that he has to, and I don't know, when he came out, I'll give him credit. He remained combative. He didn't come out and cry or something like that. But man, if you just looked at his physical, I don't know, physical self when he came out, his hair was all over the place. He was like clammy, and he was uh, visibly angry. But he had that thing, like I remember from when I was a little kid, when you're playing soccer, that every so often you get hit, you get the ball hits you in the stomach, you get the wind knocked out of you, and there's that momentary sense that it's like your body has been pulled apart or something like that, kind of ineffable kind of physical distress. And when I saw him, it kind of reminded me like that, like, man, someone clocked him, and he knows it, and he's, even his defiance cannot hide what that meant to him. And I want to come back to what you said about this whole idea of their argument is like, hey, this is just how it goes for rich people. Why does our rich guy, you know, this is rich guys get to have sex with porn stars and pay them off, and have the bag man for the money go to jail for it, and all that kind of stuff. And I think it was I don't know, kind of a lack of moral imagination, that was not a good argument, because I think most people hear that and they're like, fuck that. That doesn't sound fair to me. Like, maybe it doesn't happen to everybody, but we got you. So let's make an example of you, because that like I said, fuck that. And I do just and so that makes me wonder, like, was Trump in charge of the defense? Did this Blanche guy really have any say over the defense that they put on? And that's, I guess that's we're not going to know the answer to that.
There's another thing from the focus group that interested me, again with a caveat. I know it's only 11 people, but it's rare to see kind of quote unquote undecided voters like in conversation with each other rather than just kind of reflected in polls. And this group was really interesting because another thing that kept coming up, which I would have disregarded as a quaint notion that doesn't really survive in voters' heads today, was that the president is supposed to set a better example. And they kept coming back to this theme with, when people would say, is it that big a deal? Was this kind of politically timed to hurt him before the election? And a lot of them just kept being like, it doesn't matter. Like, this is disqualifying, and they didn't seem to care about the magnitude kind of compared to his other stuff. It was just like, the president is supposed to try to be better than everybody else, and paying off a porn star is not doing that. And I found that to be like totally fascinating, because I would have thought that in a post-Trump age, that is not an important qualification for anybody anymore. And if it does end up, if other people are in the situation that these people in, which was largely, we voted for Trump to shake things up, but he is such a mess all the time, right? We voted for Biden because he said he was going to unify everyone, but now we think he's weak and old and out of touch, and they're dissatisfied with both options. But for most of them, they were just like, one of these guys is basically in legal trouble and one isn't. And that, as much as I might not like it, like I can't vote for Trump. And I think part of this too is a messaging campaign in today's completely fractured media environment. And for what it's worth, I think this election is the biggest test we've had of the new media landscape, because even last cycle, things weren't quite as bifurcated as they are now. Like, it's all just increasing in that direction. And you've got, with the rise of TikTok, you've got a whole kind of new can of worms. And it's so hard for Democrats to get their message through that. We've talked about this a million times, without having the right-wing media ecosystem at their fingertips. And part of what I think this trial had limited salience is because it was a little bit complicated. Like, if anyone pays attention, they can follow it. But if you're just a normal person, probably all you know is porn star, right? And like not really anything beyond that. But convicted felon is quick.
Cuts through everything.
It's memorable. Even if a person doesn't know the ins and outs, they'll be able to say like, well, he's a convicted felon. I mean, it'll be in ads. I expect every Democrat to talk about this. Convicted felon is his new
his
like
first
title on his name. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, and we'll get into kind of how Democrats have been reacting, where I think there's room for lots of criticism. But I think the biggest upside of this is it was 34 of 34. There's no hedging. There's no, well, it was split this way and this way and this way. There's none of that.
It was fast.
It was within 10 hours. He is a convicted felon. Does he have the appellate process? Of course he does, but he has that stamp now. And that, I think, if anything's going to cut through, that's going to cut through.
One of our readers by email sent me an email, and she said, I think it's wrong to say convicted felon. She said criminal. Criminal is more, and her argument was criminal is the person who kind of jumps out of a bush and pulls a knife on you. It communicates violence in a way that convicted felon doesn't. And she may be right. Maybe in terms of the in terms of the messaging, maybe there's a part that I don't get, but I agree with you. And I think that's for a few reasons. One is we call all sorts of people criminals. Someone doesn't have to be convicted of a crime for you to say they're a criminal. Sometimes it's just an aspersion. Sometimes you think they've done terrible things. They haven't been convicted, but you never kind of get really mad at someone and say, you're a convicted felon, or you deserve to be if you were ever indicted for something. It's very specific. It's you did something wrong and not anything. You didn't, you weren't going 10 miles over the speed limit, right? Or you didn't kind of not get a parking permit. You committed a felony, you were charged with it, and you were convicted, and now you are a convicted felon. It is like a kind of like a bit of a scarlet letter, right? And so I completely agree. And it's just it's like a I don't know, it's just like a branding and of seriousness and a status that you. I don't know if technically you're no longer a convicted felon. If you're convicted, it's turned over on appeal. But it's sort of like you never stop being a convicted felon. You may serve out your time, but you're a convicted felon, and that's bad. And we all kind of what got you to be a convicted felon starts to fade into the mist. It's just you're a convicted felon. I don't need to read the fine print about how you got there. So no, I think that is a big deal. I do think they really need to make it his first name. And the one thing about that focus group, the funny thing is that you would think if they think the president needs to set an example, you would think that Trump was, that these were not gettable for Trump. I mean, obviously they are. So it is a little it is a little odd, and there is always this issue with this case. Is that he should have set a better example? Is it the um having a casual sexual encounter with a pornographic film star while he's married? Is it all that? Is it that thing, or is it all the stuff around that thing that actually created the criminality? And I'm struck by uh, you know something you said about one of those people in the focus groups, that all of this stuff is so outside of most of our experience. Not just that you're having a casual hookup with a porn star, but like, oh yeah, fine, I'll cut you a check for 130 grand if you won't sell your story. These are just and I'll call my man at the National Enquirer. All of these things are just so cartoonish and crazy compared to the lives that most of us live. But I do think everybody has the experience that you can do small things, fake a signature, lie on a form, and you can get in a lot of trouble. And when you get in a lot of trouble, you can't say, "Oh, come on, everybody lies on a government form sometime." Dude, tough shit. Like, I think people know you get in trouble for stuff, and kind of like it wasn't a big enough deal doesn't cut it for anybody else. And that, I mean, that to me is kind of one of the things that, I mean, look, the big deals here, the fact that he tried to overthrow the government and he carted off several truckloads of super classified information and like stored them in like a Quonset hut on his property. I mean, just bizarre shit. But this one, I remember, our colleague David Kurtz, TPM's executive editor, has made this point in sort of, editorial conversations with me, blah, 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 that when this happened, if we had known this had happened when it happened, like, oh, okay, there was about this thing to go forward, and he got this lawyer to create all these like cutout contracts with fake names, and then didn't pay taxes on the money and all that. If we had known about this at the time, everybody would be like, holy shit, tax fraud, non-reporting to the FEC, all of these kind of things. It is only because we've known about this, I think, since 2018, and almost the luridness of the Stormy stuff in a perverse kind of way diminishes the seriousness, I think, for most people, because people just see that and like, rich guys, entitled rich guys, they're having sex with porn stars nonstop. That's just how it works. But it is a pretty big deal, and the idea that kind of like, oh my God, this was just a little little not innocuous thing on a reporting on some form. I mean, everybody, just think in terms of your taxes or something. If you don't report like $100,000 on your taxes, you're going to go to jail over that. And if they can show it wasn't like incidental or accidental or something like that. So it is the idea that this is kind of like a nothing crime, kind of a constructed crime, is at the end of the day definitely part of the Trump reality distortion vortex that we've talked about. That again, if we would have known about it at the time, everybody would have known how big a deal it was, kind of on so many different levels. And it's sort of like we've been sitting in this water for 5 years or whatever it is, or 6 years, right? The boiling water with the frogs. We've kind of gotten used to it. Oh yeah, the time he paid Stormy and had the guy from the National Enquirer, and then the other he had the National Enquirer buy a story. Like, what the fuck? Like, how did this shit happen? It's really crazy stuff, and it's not made up at all. So there you go.
So let's talk about kind of reactions to the verdict. Republicans pretty quickly did the whole this was politically motivated, right? This is political persecution. You have like Susan Collins saying, well, Alvin Bragg campaigned on this, which he didn't do. But all those seeds that Trump had kind of planted, they took to their natural conclusion and threw in some kind of horrifying stuff like the jurors should explain themselves, which is a pretty naked attempt to get these people to out themselves for doxing so that
Or worse.
online, right, and so online sleuths can find that they've got an uncle who canvassed for Obama in 2012 and use that as proof that they're, hopelessly corrupted. So the Republicans have been doing, much what you would expect, though I would say the level of shrill outrage conveys the fact that they at least don't think this is a nothing burger, that they're pretty
Absolutely.
concerned.
Yep.
You actually, and you wrote in your in a post, Josh, which was a good point, that Larry Hogan, who's running for Senate in Maryland, it's such a blue place, but he was a popular governor, so there's some kind of ill-informed hand wringing, I think. But he made some super anodyne statement about how we should trust the rule of law, the rule of order, trust our judicial system. And Trump's people went batshit over it, right? They like totally came down on him, which, as you pointed out, I think both again reinforces the sense that this is a big deal and that any Republican who puts a toe out of line about it is going to be swiftly punished. So that's kind of what's going on the Republican side of things. And then on the Democratic side of things, I find it to be a little baffling what's going on. On the one hand, you've got Biden saying little, more in recent days, but it's been a kind of slow accrual of allusions in his remarks to it. And you can maybe feel like, okay, I mean, Biden's been in a tricky place with this all along, right? Because you don't, from a sense of kind of norms and democracy, you don't want him using the presidency to kind of get anywhere close to the legal process that's being used against his political opponent. I mean, that's bad news. And optics wise, I think runs the risk of him coming off as both opportunistic and kind of in a Trump style of dictatorial, right? Trying to kind of use the might of the office to influence a process that has to be impartial. But the same does not go for Democratic surrogates. I mean, if you're like a member of Congress or a Democratic governor, there is no kind of concern about upholding our norms that should keep you from going out there and talking about the fact that Biden's running against a convicted felon day in, day out. Like this should be the kind of bookend of every speech you give, whether or not it's relevant to the content of the speech. And there hasn't been near as much kind of flame throwing as I think you'd expect on the left. And I think that you'd want on the left.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I do think Biden is ideally, you would have Biden not carry the torch on this, because even though it's a state case, you don't want, all that kind of stuff. I do think he has upped the ante a bit over the last few days. But yes, that this should, and even like, what is there a norm about saying you shouldn't vote for a convicted felon? That's like saying kind of like there's a norm against not saying you shouldn't vote for a bank robber or something. Like that's actually not a norm at all. If anything, it's the reverse. We have, one of the many good and appropriate uses of the criminal justice system is it is a way that the society speaks to itself about its own standards. That you say, we don't do that. That is not acceptable. That's why we make it a felony. That's why we are going, you're subject to punishment, blah, 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 blah. There, I guess I'm a little, um, what I've seen, I've heard the volume a little louder than I think you have, but I could be
Okay.
wrong about that. But it's still certainly on like day one and day two, kind of over the weekend, there was this, like, I think Hakeem Jeffries put out a thing kind of like, got to respect our judicial process and let's move on from this very tragic, sad moment for America. And yeah, sad moment for America, but also pretty happy moment for America for a lot
Right.
of Americans. And you need to come up with a way to finesse that. But it's okay to be happy that he was held accountable because he's done a lot of bad stuff, and he has successfully been able to delay the other charges, which are even more grave, not in the sense that this one isn't grave too, but like those are, much more grave, that he should be accountable. So, you don't want to say you're psyched or happy exactly, but you should be able to say, in some way appropriate to the politician, he's been held accountable for all the things that he has done wrong, all the ways that he has damaged this country, all the laws that he has broken. That's great. And I do think, one of the big things, one of the big goals of everything you're seeing from, and I want to make clear that it's what you're seeing from elected Republicans and Republican influencers, of this totally batshit, like, the country's over, we're going to put everybody in jail, Civil War time, just totally over the top stuff, is A, to prevent any Larry Hogans, to keep everybody on side. But B, to convince Democrats, this is too hot to handle, man. I'm not touching this. To basically get Democrats to think this is a bigger problem for Democrats than it is for Republicans. Like, wow, we really, stuck the stick in the hornet's nest here, man. I'm gonna lay low because the hornets are everywhere, and you can't do that. You just can't do that. And again, I'm a little more optimistic from what I've heard but basically I agree with you. I mean, we're talking about small differences of decibels. But and the other thing, it's interesting that there was, I can't remember what poll. There's a poll that came out, I don't know, a couple days after it, asked people's reactions. And it was interesting because basically about half of Republicans said they were angry about it. And something like 75% of Republicans said they were disappointed. And so, the bigger response were, they're disappointed. And okay, I get that. He's your guy, you're bummed. It's you didn't want him held accountable, you didn't want to believe it was true, whatever. But half of people even saying they're angry, I think what you see in that stuff from name brand prominent Republicans is trying to whip everybody up, trying to create this sense of like, even those people who were saying like, oh, this is the day that Trump was elected president again. His people are so mad now, they're gonna he's got it in the bag. Not really. I don't think being convicted of a felony is a good thing for anybody. I mean, again, Trump reality distortion vortex. So there is, everybody's getting, it's another Trump con. It's not good for him, and Democrats need to, just pay attention to reality. Getting convicted of a felony is not good. And as you said, they know it's not good, and that's why they're freaking out.
The thing you cite about the lack of anger among Republicans also rings so true just by the fact that there have been no protests. I mean, in an earlier phase of Trump on the rise, the object of fascination, the newer days of the Trump cult, it's hard to imagine that people wouldn't protests, that there wouldn't be some like sizable MAGA reaction, maybe not outside the New York courtroom, maybe somewhere else, whatever, but in response to this. And there's been nothing. And I really think that means something. And I do want to get a little into polling, even though keep in mind, this is only a few days old. And I kind of think it's one of those stories that is going to marinate, which is why I still think Democrats haven't done enough, but I'm not like as concerned as I have been in, say, the Alito situation, where that story's got a shelf life. We're going to be done talking about that soon. I don't think that's as much the case with this one. So if Democrats, it frustratingly, but need to take a few days to kind of get their strategy together, I don't think that's the end of the world. But we do have some like early polling, a few national polls, and I think the most interesting result, we got one from Ipsos Reuters, and then the other one is Harris times someone else. And the things that stuck out from these two polls to me were very similar statistics, which were about 1 in 10 Republicans, it was like 10% in one, 11% in the other, are less likely to vote for Trump now that he's been convicted. And then the other one, they both had roughly 25% of independents say the same, less likely to vote for him if he's now that he's convicted. And, usual caveats, right? Voters are like historically terrible at predicting their own behavior. And less likely does not mean definitely won't. But 10% of Republicans is a huge freaking deal. I mean, that is election deciding. And if you've even got 10% who are now considering not voting for him for the first time, considering that maybe it is too much for them to swallow, that's a huge deal. That's huge. And 25% of independents is similarly huge. Like whatever percent you can knock out on the conviction alone, that's major, right? Because then there's all these other factors swirling around, and the big mystery of the election is not knowing which of those is going to be more important in the end, and who that's going to favor. But this is why it's so insane when people are like, actually being convicted helps Trump. No, of course it doesn't. And the fact that it's not disqualifying for a bigger segment of Republicans is, I get it, alarming, disheartening, so dismaying. All of that is true. But even if you've got 25% of independents and 10% of Republicans who will not vote for a convicted felon, I mean, that's a game changer, looking at the kind of election and how close it's likely to be.
No, absolutely. And that is why, again, like it has to be his first name, convicted felon Donald Trump. Because it's we talked about earlier in the pod, it just those two words are just like a brand on your skin. It is a very charged thing. That's, as much as we talk about that felon disenfranchisement and stuff, that's why the people who advocate that get far in the public debate when they say a convicted felon. Not like you double parked, convicted felon, serious crime, all that. It has a charge, and it is also natural in American language. When you talk about other people who are convicted felons, you say convicted felon so-and-so, convicted felon Kate Riga, God forbid, right? it just, you say it that way. You say it as a preface, as you said, it's like their title, Emperor Caesar Augustus, convicted felon Caesar Augustus, right? So yeah, I do, and to the point, I do think it is one of these things that, and why it has to be said again and again and again, I think it wears people down over time. You're like, convicted felon, like, wow, do you want a convicted felon like as the president? It just doesn't seem right. And as you say, this election is going to come down to a couple percentage points, and in all likelihood, one of the things that makes this election so hard to make sense of is that you've got a lot of people maybe in the mix, but who maybe aren't going to show up to vote, right? So we're talking about you know, small amounts. So I continue to think it is a huge deal. And I hope that because it is the reality and it is important, but there are these other trials coming up, and they probably won't come to they probably, the trials probably will not be held before the election, but they're still out there, right? There's still they assuming he is not elected and then just shuts them down, they're still out there. There's still ongoing processes. So I do hope that everybody will continue to say, yeah, convicted felon and his two other, or I guess three other felony cases that are still ongoing, right? You kind of cluster them together, and the fact that one has been adjudicated sort of puts a little more juice in the others, even if they will not um, even if they will not come to trial. And it's depending on what most legal observers fear is that what the Supreme Court will do, I guess, what is it? I don't know, sometime in the next few weeks with that immunity case for Trump, is that they will say something to the effect of, well, you're not immune from everything, but you're immune for things that are official acts, or they'll create a kind of a structure that some things count and some things don't. Then the Supreme Court will send it back to the trial court to litigate the charges and what he's immune from and what he does not. The judge will make decisions. Trump will appeal that to the Supreme Court. Maybe it'll go. So basically, they've created the structure where he's going to run out the clock. But if that happens, you will spend a chunk of the summer and the fall going over what he's charged with. And that's not the same as being on trial, but that'll be in the news. And again, the things he's charged with don't tell me that it's not serious when you're trying to overthrow the government. I mean, again, it's part of the sort of the nonsense world that we are all presently condemned to exist in, that even being charged with that, you're still doing well in the polls. It's insane. How the fuck are we here? But we are here. And, there's, I hope the Democrats will continue to get more aggressive, much more aggressive than they are. Although I will also say, sometimes the people come through for you when the politicals and the electeds don't, and that was kind of the lesson of 2022, right? That Democrats were kind of saying, "Oh, we're going to do everything to defend abortion rights," and some people were saying, "Dude, make a promise. Say you're going to pass a law. Make it really concrete." And they couldn't get their act together to do that. But at the end of the day, voters kind of didn't need them to. Voters were like, okay, we're gonna take this on our own. We don't need you to spell it out. We can see what's happening. So hopefully there'll be some mix of Democrats raising the volume and the American public sort of doing it on their own.
I do think the raising the volume will be easier for them in this case because this fits into the seemingly favored kind of theory of the election, which is fundamentally Trump is only out for himself, right? And I think they've found that is the easiest way to defang the Trump stirs shit up, but he does it for me, right? He doesn't respect the establishment for us normals. And I think they found that contrasting that with Trump's fundamental selfishness is an effective message and a flexible one, right? You can turn that into the tax cuts for him and his wealthy buds, the kind of schmoozing with people who, dictators who are nice to him. It just kind of, it has the convenience of being true, and it also just can apply across the board. And this is so perfect for that, right? Trump is only running for president in the first place to get himself out of legal trouble. And if he wins, is there any doubt in your mind that he's going to spend all his time kind of getting back at people? And now this is just a kind of picture perfect situation. First thing he's going to do if he wins the presidency is to try to, get Merchan impeached or put him in jail for something. There's just, it's obviously true.
Mm-hmm.
So, it runs in the same vein as like with those focus group people, kind of, even the ones who thought it was like icky that there was a trial close before the election. None of them were like, and these trumped up fabricated charge. Like, no, everybody knows that he did it, right? I mean, it's too in fitting with what we know about him, which is why I think this thesis of, he's out for himself, that's all he cares about, like, this will, I think, slot in nicely with that and help Democrats kind of get their heads around how to keep making this case and then add the convicted felon gloss on top of it.
Couldn't agree more. And all these things, you've got to connect it up. How does it actually affect me? And that is how it affects me. That it's not just that he violated this law that maybe I didn't know about. It is all about him. He only cares about himself. And that is a, as you said, it is a coherent, strong, and true message. And it's funny, I think we've talked about this in other pods, but and this isn't something that gets into slogans, but it's sort of the more rarefied part of the campaign. What is his agenda? He the one thing that is actually kind of a policy thing that he has is this thing that would make inflation go through the roof, which is putting a 10% tariff on everything and like 60% on China. And it's not great that like everything we buy is made in China, but for the moment it is. And that, so, but basically it's all kind of like, I'm going to kick everybody's ass. And I'm gonna put Merchan in jail and Joe Biden in jail and Merrick Garland in jail, and then I'm gonna, deport a bunch of people. It's just revenge. He doesn't give a crap about you, and it's seldom it's seldom so obviously true, right? So yeah, I hope they can craft that together, because it does all fit together fairly seamlessly.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Well, I guess just briefly,
Former
let's
president.
mention that the
Oh,
Washington
yeah.
Post thing. So the executive editor of the Post was fired by the publisher a couple days ago, and they're bringing in all these kind of Fleet Street, Rupert Murdoch type executives there and everything, and that has created another stir in the journalism world. It's different from when a kind of a medium sized or small publication goes under, because the Post is sort of like part of the journalistic firmament. They employ hundreds of journalists. Do you have a sense of this? I mean, you live down in DC now, so this is kind of in your community. What's your sense of this?
Yeah. So the contours we know are that the Post, lost something like $70 million last year. It's famously owned by Jeff Bezos, right? One of these projects where very rich people like to kind of take on media outlets for some combination of feeling good about themselves, public service type stuff. But at the same time, don't tend to love businesses that lose millions of dollars. So the Post was already considering kind of doing a kind of interesting newsroom restructure where there's one vertical that's dedicated to like community and quote unquote service journalism. And it seems that will be broken out from the more like political journalism kind of meat and potatoes of the paper. And this would have, and I guess the idea was to have Sally Busby, the one who was fired, perhaps kind of head up one of these subdivisions within the newsroom, and that would have amounted to a pretty big abrogation of her power because she's in charge of all news content at the time, and the Post's first woman to ever have the job of being head of news operations. So she was like, well, I'm not going to take a demotion, basically. And that was the end of that. Super abrupt, super weird to get rid of one of your kind of news execs a few months out from an election. Like, really can't emphasize enough how odd of timing that is. You would, even if there was kind of tension and even if it was untenable, you would probably expect her to stay through the election and then transition out. And then the guy who's kind of temporarily in charge, as you say, gets 3 white men who he's kind of worked with at previous stages of his career to head up each of these new divisions. And the newsroom is unhappy for kind of a few reasons. Like, one, they seem to be in pretty much in solidarity that Busby was treated pretty shabbily, that she was given kind of the bum's rush after she had really expanded their editorial capacity. You know, they won, I think, 6 Pulitzers kind of under her direction. It was not lost on them that the only woman to have that job was pretty summarily replaced with 3 white men. Were suddenly, and this is a weird theme we're seeing in a bunch of the legacy publications, that British journalists are suddenly being put into very big executive controlling roles, which I think gives people a lot of pause, because the British journalism world is so famously, um, you know,
Shady.
ethicless.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so there's this whole stew is happening, right? And I think the timing of it just makes it all seem kind of more fraught and existential, because it's scary to do these kind of very big newsroom shakeups when the most important part of your year, probably both content wise and financially, is upon you. And you're suddenly
Yeah.
going to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and try something new.
Yeah, obviously, at one level, people are worried about losing their jobs, right? If you're running a $70 million deficit, that is a massive shortfall, even for a big organization. So people are worried about their job security, very understandably. You have this kind of bringing in the Brits, which, as you say, has a kind of a funny feeling to it. There's the diversity issue, which is not just for white men, but also one white man who's the publisher, and then like 3 of his bros, basically. So you got all these kind of things going together, and then that kind of the third newsroom, or the third branch. Service journalism can mean like there's a lot, news you can use. Is that going to be like a lot of product reviews? Is it like, that can be like, oh, on the more positive side, maybe that can be like, oh, we're gonna have a lot of information about climate, or, as I said, kind of product reviews, or how to install a window. And I mean, look, I'm all about DIY stuff, but there's it's funny because it's a hard thing, because these organizations are running big deficits, and maybe your billionaire owner is willing to float those, but ordinary businesses can't do that. So that's not if you happen to have a billionaire owner, maybe you can be the exception that proves the rule, but that's not really viable. And a lot of
And they
people
don't tend to love covering these shortfalls anyway, even though they've got endless pockets to do so.
Yeah. And so, there are a lot of people who really have their heart in the right place, trying to think of, okay, how do we, how do you make this work in this day and age? But there were some of the comments from that guy that did seem very, I don't know, startup-y. I'm gonna yank off the bandage, and kind of like a lot of jargon of like, you're kind of like a turnaround artist, that if I were at the Post, I would think, oof, like, we do have problems, but this guy's giving me a bad vibe.
Yeah,
Kind of feeling.
particularly he had one bit where he was like, well, I don't want to rub salt in the wound, but your audience is halved from what it was. Like, people just aren't reading you, like, we need to make a change. And it's like, dude, I mean, to kind of like take readership issues in our current time and decide it's because, even like
Your work
solely
product
because of
sucks.
content, and not because of the absolute sea change that we've gone through with Google and SEO and the way people receive media, which has caused the death of countless outlets and the layoffs of countless employees. And not to mention that in this meeting, I mean, that's a red flag. Come on.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, almost every publication, TPM included, lost subscribers after Trump left office. That is a big structural thing that affected everybody. I am cautiously optimistic that we have, you know, found a way to sort of round that corner. But that affected everybody, and it affected the Post a lot. There's various reasons why it seems to have the Times. Has been able to weather it a little bit more. Part of that's just because of the Times that, one paper can be so big that it's got something for everybody, and also they've got Wordle, right? So
Right.
it is that I'm glad you pointed that out, that one remark, because that's the statement that kind of like, dude, like either you don't know what's really happening in this news economy, or that's just a cheap shot. Because look, a massive deficit like that needs to be filled, and kind of no crying in baseball. Just because people are reading less news doesn't mean that we can ignore that. But he was kind of saying like, hey, it's you guys who sucked. It didn't publish any
Exactly.
good articles.
Well,
So,
and
and
it
that's
makes
not
you
that's not what it's about.
and it makes you concerned because, we criticize the Post. I think you should criticize all the kind of industry behemoths, but n- no one would sit here saying that the Post doesn't do absolutely critical work at the absolute top tier of journalism. Like, of course they do. I mean, the
Yeah.
Washington Post is like why I became a journalist in the first place. And it's so concerning to hear this guy be like, well, the not even the subtext, the translation is, if you guys wrote better articles, we wouldn't be in this place. And then you're like, what's a better article, right? I mean, this is the trap that how many kind of I know everything about media dudes have fallen into, which is like more junk food, less vegetables, right? More clickbait, less investigations. And that is, I mean, a death spiral for a media outlet, and is not even relevant really today, because the reason why the kind of junk food clickbaity stuff has died off too is because digital advertising is not a kind of enough of a revenue stream to keep you afloat anymore. So it's like, okay, well, what's your idea, sir? What direction do you want to take the Post in? And it's just kind of a scary prospect.
Yeah, no, and it does. His ideas, at least as presented in these very few articles that are based on kind of group, kind of all staff meeting they had, his ideas seem pretty shoot from the hip, and
Yep.
and not thought through. And look, I'm sympathetic. I mean, we on an infinitely smaller scale, we live in the same world. How do you make it work? And it's really complicated, because if it were if it were obvious, a lot of people would have figured it out. So it's hard, but you as a leader in a journalistic organization, you want to be able to communicate, instill some confidence that you've got a plan, and not just that you have a plan, but that it's a plan that comes from some real dedication to journalism. And sometimes you have to do some things that aren't anti-journalism, but like I said, one of the things that really seems to be helping the Times now, they're killing it with games. Wordle, the crossword, they've got a bunch of Wordle like things. And honestly, that's awesome. If that is allowing them to put the pieces together, fantastic. I mean, we shouldn't, in the old days with papers, there's the cartoon page, there's sports, there's uh there's what
Style.
there's a style, the crossword, the kind of crime stories. It Newspapers in the old days were never just about the sort of the important civic news. There's always just a ton of feel good stuff that you read it for, and that's there too. And maybe games are that. So it's it's not that, oh, maybe you've got to like cut journalistic corners. Sometimes you need to be creative and bring people to the product, and that's hard. But when sometimes the people in charge say things like this guy has, and you're like, ooh, like he has no idea, and he's not really grounded in the journalism, and that's that's kind of scary. And that is kind of scary, right? There's no
And
two ways about that.
it's just fundamentally pretty crazy to like convene an all hands when you're telling people that the kind of widely liked and respected head of news operations is summarily out on her butt, and then not even be able to kind of follow that up with, and here's our, our comprehensive plan of how we're going to go forward. Instead, it's just kind of an outline and a guy who doesn't really seem to respect the product of the employees who are now worried about their jobs, and he won't really explain why the old news operator head doesn't want to stay on anymore. I mean, it's worrisome.
Yeah, and clearly it came to a head, and he was not prepared to have any of these conversations. But it also seems pretty clear that he brought it to a head.
Exactly.
Right? I'm sure that in the conversations with Busby, he could have said, "Look, this is what I need to do. Let's get through the election. We'll kind of punt it to pass the election. You stay on. You can, there's ways you do this, right? A couple months out, she says, I'm so excited for this election. After the election, I'm going to move on to another challenge, and kind of whatever. But there was some kind of rush or sort of impulsive decision making that came into the mix here. And even though someone like a Jeff Bezos is, if Jeff Bezos wants to cut a check for $100 million every year forever, great, awesome. He's probably not going to want to do that. But what you would hope for having someone like Jeff Bezos as the owner is you could say, okay, we're going to let this ride for a few months. We've got enough, we've got enough financial cushion to we don't, play it, let this play out for a few more months, and then we'll kind of deal with it after the election. You expect a strapped, financially pressured organization to have to move this fast. And clearly that's not the case, because I actually looked it up this morning. Jeff Bezos worth almost $200 billion, right? I mean, and that's not the case. So it's worrisome. And I guess we'll see how it plays out. So, okay, on that bright note, I think that's all we got for this week. Anything else?
I think that's about it.
All right, so we'll talk to you next week.
All right, see you then.
Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.